Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back to my channel for another episode in my history series, where today we're going to be talking about something that you've probably never heard of. The 1858 Bradford sweets poisoning. Yet another moment in history where standards just aren't what they are today and so people died. Health and safety standards are actually a fairly recent thing, no shock to anyone. For centuries, care just wasn't really taken in ensuring that people didn't die. In 1858, some 20 people died and more than 200 people became seriously ill after being poisoned by some sweets. I actually heard about this case myself in a podcast called The Alarmist, which I've recently been very obsessed with and just have to recommend it to you guys. The premise is fantastic. They basically take all of history's greatest tragedies and try and figure out exactly what went wrong, but more importantly, who's to blame. The podcast is really funny, but it's also very educational and informative. You guys are always asking what podcast I'm enjoying, so here you go. They're who gave me the idea for this video. And whilst we're talking about things I enjoy, this video is sponsored by Magellan TV, the documentary streaming service. I'm sure you've all already heard why I love Magellan TV, so instead of listing all the reasons in this video, I'm just going to jump straight into telling you about a documentary that I've watched recently and absolutely loved, Jack the Ripper, the German Suspect. It's no secret that I have a fascination with Jack the Ripper. I spent a lot of time trying to learn everything I possibly can about this Victorian London killer. I've been on the tours, I've made the videos, I've read all the books, so of course I was all over this documentary as soon as I saw it in the new releases section on Magellan about a German sailor called Karl Feigenbaum. I had heard of him before, but a deep dive into who he was and why he was considered a suspect was fascinating. I'm a pretty easy person to sway, so when I finished this I was like, yes, it was Karl, but now I don't really know. No one knows, that's the point. I won't spoil the documentary too much for you, but it really does make some interesting points in favour of Karl being the Ripper, and I would highly recommend giving it a watch, so just try out Magellan TV to do so. And you can watch all their other documentaries too, they have more than you could dream of. Magellan TV actually have a great offer going on at the moment where viewers can take advantage of a special holiday offer. Buy one, get one free gift card for an annual membership, and you can check that out by clicking on the link in the description. Our story today begins in Bradford here in England, the second largest city in West Yorkshire thanks to the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th century. Bradford was a boom town, undergoing a huge population growth in a short amount of time, thanks to its close proximity to a supply of coal, iron ore and soft water. It quickly became known for its textiles industry, particularly wool. At one point Bradford was known as the wool capital of the world and it was hugely prosperous. Sadly, in the mid-20th century, deindustrialisation has caused the textiles manufacturing to decline, and that's hit the city quite hard. It's caused significant economic challenges. In 1858 though, Bradford was booming and lots of people had money to go out and treat themselves to things like sweets. Because sweets in the 1800s were not cheap. And as you'll come to find out in this video, they honestly should have been even more expensive than what they were. There was drama in the UK back in 2018 when a sugar tax was written into law, meaning that manufacturers of soft drinks containing more than 5 grams of sugar per 100 millilitres were made to pay a levy of 18p a litre to the Treasury. A lot of people call it the Coke tax because the only time you'll really notice it is in the price of Coke. Or at least as an avid full-fat Coke drinker who thinks that sugar-free drinks taste like trash, I know I really notice it. So if you ever visit the UK and wonder why Coke is 18p more expensive than any other soft drink, now you know why. But this in 2018 wasn't the first sugar tax that's ever been imposed on the UK. Back in 2018 it was put in place to motivate manufacturers to cut back on the amount of sugar in their products. But throughout history, sugar taxes have been put in place because sugar was a luxury. It's something that doesn't grow on our dull and rainy island. It had to be imported. It's thought that the monarchy in England had access to sugar as early as 1264, but it wasn't until the 14th century that it became more common. But even then it was still only really available to the super rich. It was sold back then at 2 shillings a pound, about £50 in today's money. By the 17th and 18th centuries, we mostly got our sugar from plantations in the West Indies, and trading ports across England grew wealthy from the trade. Whilst I'm sure it was enslaved people growing said sugarcane. History is anything but ethical, it's never nice. According to an article on historicuk.com by Ben Johnson, by 1750 there were 120 sugar refineries open across Britain, but even then they could only produce 30,000 tonnes of sugar per year. Not that much when you divide that per person at the time. Prices reflected this rarity and it was super expensive. The government, recognising this, taxed it highly. In 1815, the British government raised £3 million in tax from sugar alone. Sugar just wasn't accessible to the regular working class person. And of course, sugar is kinda one of the main ingredients in any form of sweet or confectionery. Back in the day, sugar would have to be bulked out with a substance called daft. It would either replace the sugar entirely or just make the little sugar you had go even further. And this was something that was called the adulteration of food, and it was done regularly back in the day. Food would be mixed with inedible substances so people could either make more money or just make their ingredients go further. You would think in the past that food would be made with only pure ingredients, untouched by chemicals and additives, that the food in general would have been much healthier. But that actually is a myth. It couldn't be further from the truth, at least in Britain. Bread would be made with bad flour, salt, potatoes, rice, and an additive called alum or sulphate of copper, which was actually pretty poisonous. Sometimes it would even be bone dust, white clay, magnesia, etc. Brewers would add molasses, capsicum, licorice root, etc. to their beers despite laws outlawing this. Coffee beans would be mixed with peas and tea leaves would be bulked out with other random leaves, literally leaves from the great outdoors. It was very normal to bulk out food with whatever you could find. Sometimes it would be safe, other times not so much. And this was both manufacturers and sellers and the regular person just trying to make their ingredients go further. Sweets were bulked out with this substance daft. You'll sometimes hear daft called daff or duck or terra alba. I'm going to stick with daft for the sake of this video. Daft was a mixture of powdered limestone, sulphate of lime and plaster of Paris. It wasn't particularly good tasting and I wouldn't see it passing any food standards nowadays, but it was actually pretty harmless to ingest. If that's what you were actually ingesting, that is. All of which brings us to October 1858, when 21 people, including children, suddenly died and more than 200 others fell horrifically ill. At first the deaths were attributed to cholera, which was rife at the time, but it soon became clear that that was not the case. It didn't take a genius to quickly work out that all of the people sick and dying had recently had sweets, specifically peppermint lozenges from a local seller called William Hardacre. William was well known in Bradford. Locals called him Humbug Billy, and he had a popular confectionery stall at the Green Market, which is actually now the site of the Arndale Centre for anyone in Bradford. But William was simply the seller of the sweets. He didn't make them. The manufacturer who made them and he bought them off of was a man called Joseph Neal, and he commonly used daft in the making of his sweets. The lozenges, in this case peppermint humbugs, were made with peppermint oil incorporated into a base of sugar and gum. But as we've already covered, sugar was expensive, so daft was substituted for a portion of this. Neal had his own sweet store on Stone Street where he sold his own sweets as well as manufacturing them for other sellers. When in mid-October, Hardacre put in an order for £40 of peppermint lozenges for the local fair that he was going to sell at, Neal started the process of making them fresh. But as Hardacre had asked for the lozenges at a low price, Neal was going to have to add a lot of daft. On Monday, 18th of October, Neal sent James Archer, one of his employees, to the druggist to pick up some daft. But when Archer arrived, the chemist, 36-year-old Charles Hodgson, was ill and objected to selling it. However, Archer insisted, so eventually Hodgson directed his assistant, William Goddard, to get the quantity of daft required. Hodgson told Goddard to go upstairs into the garret and in a tub in the corner of the room he would find the daft. However, when Goddard did this, he found there were 2 tubs in 2 separate corners, one containing the daft and the other containing the poison arsenic. They both looked pretty much the same, they were both white powders. Goddard had only recently left school and been working for Hodgson for just 3 weeks at this time, so he hadn't learned very much. He didn't know yet how to spot the subtle differences between arsenic and daft, because they were both white powders after all. You're not going to know the difference unless you are a pro. Goddard ended up weighing out 12 pounds of arsenic, under the impression that it was the daft. He gave it to Archer, who then took it back to Neil at the sweet store. Neil wasn't actually the one who ended up making the sweets though. That task fell to James Appleton, an employee of his. Appleton was reportedly an experienced sweet maker, but at no point in the process did he realise that the daft he was using was actually not daft at all. And this would have been a substance he worked with quite regularly. Either he wasn't paying enough attention, or the daft and the arsenic really did look pretty much the same. Apparently though, he did notice that the finished product looked different than usual, but he didn't question it too much. As you would expect, working with so much arsenic, Appleton did fall ill himself during the process, and was ill for several days afterwards with vomiting and pain in his hands and arms. He didn't know what had caused his illness, but he did eventually recover. When Neil then sold the sweets to Hardacre noticed that they looked different from usual, a different colour, something he used to obtain a discount from Neil without investigating any further. And as any good sweet seller would, Hardacre tasted the sweets after he bought them. He fell ill himself, but not until after he'd sold 5 pounds of sweets at the fair on the evening of Saturday 30th of October. Luckily, it was later noted that a slow train that day meant there were much less people at the fair than expected that evening, and Hardacre didn't sell nearly as much as he expected. Because of this, many lives were probably saved. It's not known exactly how many people got ill as a result of eating these peppermint humbugs. We know that it was definitely over 200 people though, and it was bad. 21 people died, a lot of these being the deaths of children. Because lots of people had travelled into the city for the fair, the sweets ended up travelling pretty far out, to Leeds and Bolton. But as I said earlier, it didn't take a genius to figure out what caused these deaths, especially when so many had been reported. The trail easily led back to Hardacre's sweet stall, and from there back to Neil and Hodgson. An analytical chemist found that each humbug contained between 14 and 15 grains, so that's between 910 and 970 milligrams of arsenic, although some more contemporary accounts suggest that it might have been closer to 9 grains or 580 milligrams. For context, a lethal dose is anywhere from 140 to 1400 milligrams for your average size adult, so less than 1/8 of a teaspoon. Even less than that is needed to kill a child, an elderly person, or an adult with impaired health. There could have been enough arsenic in a single lozenge to kill 2 adults, let alone if you're treating yourself to more than 1 sweet, which generally tends to be the case. The druggist assistant, Goddard, was arrested for manslaughter swiftly on the following Monday, and the case quickly went to court. Then Hodgson, the druggist, was also arrested on the same charge. Then it came to light that Neil, the sweet maker, had continued to use some scraps left over from the making of the poison lozenges to make other sweets, even after he'd found out what had happened. When the judge heard this, he ordered that Neil be arrested as well. Towards the end of December, 36-year-old Charles Hodgson stood trial for the manslaughter of Elizabeth Mary Midgley on the 3rd of November, caused by gross negligence. Elizabeth had been bought some sweets by her grandmother, and she soon became ill, dying a few later with all the symptoms of poison. Lozenges were analysed, they were found to contain arsenic. However, after a witness or 2 had been called at trial, the judge said that the charge against Hodgson could not be sustained, as he considered that he had not been guilty or culpable of criminal negligence. He couldn't be held responsible for Goddard's mistake of opening the wrong jar. So the prosecution consequently abandoned the case, and Hodgson was acquitted for the crime. However, there were several other charges of manslaughter against him as well for all of the other deaths, to which he was also pleading not guilty. Because the prosecution offered no evidence for any of these, he was also acquitted on them, and the charges against Neil and Goddard were also excused. The judge acknowledged that warning signs were missed, that it should have been picked up on, like an untrained assistant being allowed access to poisons unsupervised, the fact that Appleton got sick whilst making the sweets, and the colour discrepancy. This was said to be just a series of unfortunate events. I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like somebody should have been held responsible. People, children died, but honestly, I can't pinpoint who was at fault here. It's not something that would happen nowadays, is it? Poison wouldn't be allowed to be sat in a jar, in a corner, unlabelled. Untrained people wouldn't be allowed access to it. It's very hard to compare history like this with modern times because this just wouldn't happen nowadays thanks to the laws that are now in place. And part of the reason why it doesn't happen nowadays is because of this event. In the aftermath, a committee was set up to distribute financial aid to families who had been affected, with both dead and sick or recovering loved ones. In some cases, lots of members of the same family were dead or ill, because when you get a treat like sweets, you share them around, don't you? But this went deeper than the community. This prompted the authorities and professionals to re-examine how drugs and poison were handled, as well as take a deeper look at the adulteration of foods and why it was allowed. A decade later, the Pharmacy Act of 1868 was brought in, basically saying that only qualified druggists and pharmacists were allowed to sell poison and other dangerous drugs. There was a lot more accountability put in place. A chemist or a druggist had to sign as the custodian and seller of named poisons, which was actually just the old Victorian name for your standard medicine. You would no longer be able to get away with selling random drugs with no chain of custody. Pharmacists had to be a lot more careful about why they were selling and to whom. This requirement to keep careful records and to also get the signature of the purchaser is still upheld in the UK today as part of the Poisons Act of 1973. So if you wonder why you've got to sign your name when you go and get your drugs from the pharmacy, that's why. 7 years after the Pharmacy Act was brought in, the Sale of Food and Drug Act was also put into action, preventing the unadvertised adulteration of food, drink and drugs. You were still allowed to mess with food as long as you said you'd done so. But then again, this was Victorian England and a lot of people didn't follow the rules. It was a very unlawful time to be alive. Every man for themselves. The analyst who had been the one to look at the lozenges in the immediate aftermath of the poisoning, Felix Remington, became a borough analyst for Bradford. He worked closely with the authorities to provide chemical and drug expertise and analysis. He became a key figure in enforcing the Sale of Food and Drugs Act locally. He was a very important person in making sure that something like the sweets poisoning never happened again. Also, the abolition of the sugar tax in 1874 meant that sugar became affordable to all, and this wouldn't happen again, at least not under these same circumstances. So, I'm very intrigued to find out from you guys, who do you think is to blame for this? I'd say the chain of custody has to go back to the pharmacist, Hodgson, surely. I know he was ill and told his assistant to get the daft, but he should have known that Goddard wasn't trained and shouldn't be left to his own devices. But then again, something doesn't feel right about judging history by today's standards. This wasn't a law, this wasn't common practice back then. You kind of just expected that the assistant would get on with it and choose the right thing. I don't know, is that maybe putting too much faith in other people? Is he stupid for leaving poison unlabelled? But it wasn't law to leave it labelled, so why would he think to do that? I don't know, maybe a bit of common sense needs to come into play here. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video as interesting as I did. I loved researching this one. And check out Magellan TV, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.